Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. Today on Perspectives, we're delving into Afro-Latin American, Caribbean, and Spanish literatures. Our guest has a keen interest in Afro-Latin Americans and how they endured the extreme trauma in the colonial era and their embracing of emancipation. His research also examines race, slavery, and African ideas of spirit and cosmos in 19th century Black Cuban literature. His work is part of a broader project of literary and historical recovery, akin to what Toni Morrison, the famous author, has termed a kind of literary archaeology. He has also published peer-reviewed articles, book chapters, and encyclopedia entries on Cuban writers of African descent. His first book, Cuban Literature in the Age of Black Insurrection, Manzano, Placido, and Afro-Latino Religion, is part of the Caribbean Studies series of the University Press of Mississippi. Now, he was a visiting scholar in Latin American Studies collections at the University of Texas in Austin, and a Langston Hughes visiting professor at the University of Kansas. He is Dr. Matthew Pettway, Associate Professor of Spanish at the University of South Alabama, where he is also a part of the African American Studies program. Dr. Petway teaches Afro-Latin American, Caribbean, and Spanish literatures. Dr. Matthew Pettway, a Detroit, Michigan native, is our guest today on Perspectives, an associate professor of Spanish. He's also in the Department of Modern and Classical Languages and Literature at the University of South Alabama. And Dr. Petway is a 2024-25 Fulbright Scholar to Brazil. Well, after a quick break this morning, we'll talk with our guest, Dr. Matthew Pettway, about his being awarded as a Fulbright Scholar, how historic his selection is, his scheduled Fulbright trip to Brazil, and his other research and writings on enslaved Black men and boys. So, Perspectives, we continue in just a moment. Welcome back, and as mentioned, Dr. Matthew Pettway, a Fulbright Scholar and Associate Professor at South Alabama. He's our guest today, and we thank you so much for having a moment before you head off to Brazil here in a short period of time. Let's go back and start because the last name, Petway, is a name familiar to a lot of folk in the area.
That's right.
What are your connections to any roots here in the Mobile area? Because in your bio, you say Detroit, Michigan as your home.
So Detroit, Michigan is home. Thanks for having me today. Detroit, Michigan is home, but it turns out that Petway is an Alabama name tied to Gee's Bend.
Okay.
And so that's where the slave labor camp or plantation was located. And so my grandfather left Mobile. My father was born here in Mobile, but my grandfather had to leave because he had an altercation with a white man. And that was a time in the history of Alabama where such a challenge, to white male power.
Was that still during Jim Crow days?
During the Jim Crow era, was not allowed. And so my grandmother told him, you got to get out of town. And so though my father was born here, he was raised in Detroit.
Yeah, I understand that because so many of our people had to take that. Being from Georgia, we always say that midnight train from Georgia. You got to head to the north as quick as you can.
That's right.
So we have the local connection, but your talent and your information research and the educational background is a worldwide thing now because we had a chance to see some of your tapes and recordings of you in action in Japan and Morocco, and it's all about history though. How did you begin your thought process about researching the Cuban experience in all of this?
I think my relationship to Cuba is largely derived from the fact that Cuba is a place where, for the wars of independence, Black men were the overwhelming majority of the fighters, called the Mambises. And I'm talking about the war that was fought for over a 30-year period, from 1868 to 1898.
Okay, so following our Civil War.
Yeah, following our Civil War.
Was that what they had with against Spain?
Against Spain,
okay.
Yeah. The Cuban War for Independence was different than the United States War for Independence in 1776 because it was a war for national independence and to abolish slavery, and it had a kind of officially it had a non-racial rhetoric there are no blacks, there are no whites, there are only Cubans.
Right.
This didn't always turn out to be true in practice.
Exactly. A lot of thought process to make us believe that, because in reading some of the Cuban history, I've always had a fascination with it also, how they had periods of where they had to figure out a way to get more of the white Spanish people to migrate there from Europe.
That's right.
Because they didn't like the numbers.
That's right.
And as you were saying, many of them were people of military importance, as well as some of the civic importance in the government. So some people didn't really like that aspect of it.
That's right. Throughout Latin America, in the 20th century, there's a process to whiten Latin America. George Reed Andrews writes about this in Afro-Latin America, one of his pieces. Cuba was no exception to the rule. And so many Europeans were invited to Cuba, and it really changed in some ways, I would say, the complexion of Cuba. And unfortunately, the story of those independence fighters, there were some black women that fought as well, but it was an overwhelmingly black male force. It was whitened. That story was whitened. It was changed. It was made more palatable to an international readership.
My goodness, and it's always interesting how that changes. And would some of the inquisition of the Jewish people in Spain, because we know many of them went to Cuba, and some of American people are learning now that they have Jewish heritage, and though they thought they were Hispanic. So were they also a part of that lightning?
There is a Jewish history in Cuba. I'm not very familiar with it, but there is a position, there's a Jewish population there. And even after the Cuban Revolution, which triumphed in 1959, you do have a Jewish population that still remains. In fact, you can find synagogues in Cuba.
And I guess, of course, it would probably depend on which part of the island they were in, to where they had the freedom to do that, because so many had to pretend to be Catholic in that.
I can say that during the long Spanish Empire in Cuba, that would have been from 1511 until 1898 that the Spanish Empire, remains. And during that period, Catholicism was the official religion of Cuba. So there wasn't any room to practice one's religion in the open, and that's really where you get a sense of camouflage, intermingling, and even a transformation of Catholic practices among Africans, a transformation of African practice into something new.
So when you start at your beginning of sharing this story, of course, as I mentioned, you're sharing this internationally now, and your times in Japan and Morocco, just what I've seen, you are able to share this story. Where do you start with this? Where do you tell people? You brought your book with you, and so when you start telling the story and laying that foundation to teach, what is it where do you start?
If I'm talking about the authors that I treat in the book, I like to say that you have two very important figures. Juan Francisco Manzano, who was kind of like a Cuban Frederick Douglass, though he published his slave narrative 5 years before Douglass in 1840 in an English translation. And I also like to think about Gabriel de la Concepcion Valdez, or Plácido, as a Martin Delany type figure, because he was born free. And he was an advocate for black liberation, quite frankly, even though the term black was not used universally for all people of African descent. There were several different categories, racial categories among people of African descent, kind of like there would have been in colonial New Orleans.
But Côte d'Ivoire, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. There. So I typically start there. I like to explain that these two authors were experienced extreme trauma in different types of ways. Manzano, as an enslaved person, he experienced physical violence, he experienced sexual violence. Manzano taught himself to read and write, much like Douglass. He produced the first collection of poetry by anyone, black or white, in Cuba. And Plácido was the most prolific Cuban writer of the 19th century. Very much a poet of the people, improvising poetry, which is akin to rapping, quite frankly, writing fables in verse, and then challenging the authority of the Queen of Spain to enslave.
Was it someone we would know of at that time? Who was the queen?
Isabel the Second.
Okay, okay.
Or in English, Isabella.
So what was it like for the Afro-Cuban population at that time, considering you were talking about an island as compared to the United States and open, free range, and technically you could get away and go somewhere, but in the island, you know, if you don't have a boat, I guess you're kind of having to deal with the issues.
Yeah, it was, if you're talking about the 19th century, movement out of the island might have been possible, but it would have, I imagine it would have been difficult. Perhaps you would have to do it in a clandestine way. Right. Free people of African descent, known as free people of color, la gente de color, they had a greater margin of movement, but even they had to carry papers with them. And they had to be obsequious when they were having social interactions with white Cubans or Spaniards, particularly Spaniards. And so Plácido, for example, he was arrested on several occasions for his poetry. He was ultimately accused of being the mastermind and the leader behind a conspiracy to annihilate the white population. That was the accusation. Not to abolish slavery, but to annihilate the white population. And Manzano was accused along with him.
We're going to take a break because we've got a whole lot more to talk about and share. And you can see the similarities in the issues that were dealt with here in the United States.
Absolutely.
Happened right there in Cuba as well.
Absolutely.
I understand your fascination for sure.
Yes.
Our very special guest, Dr. Matthew Pettway, as we talk more on Perspectives in just a moment. And welcome back to Perspectives. Our very special guest today, Dr. Matthew Pettway, and we're talking about your first book, which you've written papers and other peer perspectives, I should say, about the subject matter. And this one here, tell us the name of this one so we can make sure that people are aware.
My first book is Cuban Literature in the Age of Black Insurrection, Manzano, Plácido, and Afro-Latino Religion, and University Press of Mississippi.
Excellent.
Published it, yeah.
Excellent. And you were sharing with us some of the, I guess you almost say some of the mirrors of what was taking place in America, and some even taking place earlier in Cuba, as we were talking about the person we could call the or the Frederick Douglass of Cuba.
Yeah, Frederick Douglass of Cuba, yeah. Plácido, or Juan Francisco Manzano in this instance. I like to consider him the Frederick Douglass of Cuba because he is very important for the history of Cuba. He provided the only slave narrative written by a person enslaved in Spanish America, written by the person themselves. It's the only one written by an enslaved person. And his narrative is acknowledged as a birth, really, of Cuban narrative because his slave narrative was taken as kind of an ethnographic account by white reformists that were interested in ending the slave trade to Cuba because they were afraid that if Cuba became very black, there might be a revolution in Cuba as there was in Haiti.
And you were speaking 1840s?
Yeah, well, if we're talking about his narrative, he starts, we believe, in 1834. There's a series of letters between him and Domingo del Monte, who was the white reformer, also slave owner. And in 1835, those letters stop. We only have Manzano's letters. Del Monte's letters don't remain, so they may have been destroyed for political reasons. And I believe it's 1836. Some scholars say 1835, but I believe it's 1836 that he was actually, that we can say we know he was done with the autobiography, because he had to hand it over in exchange for his freedom. There was a quid pro quo. Essentially. Yeah.
Wow. Well, let me ask you this. How is this received when you take this story to the different places overseas and around the world, and in America when they get to hear the comparisons? Because sometimes when you say the word Cuba, it automatically puts up a wall by people because of Castro from that period to today. But We're talking about, as you said, from the 1400s or 15, what was it, 15?
1511.
1511.
Spain conquers Cuba.
Up to the time of Castro.
Yeah.
There's a history that needs to be shared.
That's right. That's right. There's very much a history that needs to be shared. Interestingly enough, the first place that I lectured about the book was in Brazil.
Okay. Oh,
yeah,
okay.
in northeast Brazil, Fortaleza, at the
early 2000s.
Actually 2019, a month
okay.
before the book was actually published.
Now, didn't you do something in Brazil though before then, back early
I did.
days? Okay.
I was in Brazil in 2005. So
Right.
Yeah.
So you were drawn to Brazil as well.
To Brazil.
Tell us the significance for those who don't know about the slave importation to Brazil and, of course, South America. Share some of that.
Brazil, I would say, is extraordinarily important in the history of the black world because Brazil is the country where more enslaved people were taken, more Africans were taken to Brazil against their will than any other country in the Western Hemisphere. And so outside of Nigeria, Brazil has the largest population of African descent today.
And the numbers are more than we have here.
Large, much larger. The numbers are much larger. It's close to half of the population. Brazil is also important because about 70% of the Africans taken to Brazil against their will were taken from Angola.
Oh, really?
And with my new project, I'm looking particularly at the men that were taken to Brazil, the men and boys, because they were 2/3. So the Atlantic slave trade, I view it as a large, really an act of black misandry or anti-black misandry, an attack on black men and boys who were the warriors defending their communities, who may have found themselves either defeated by Portuguese army or ensnared in the slave trade in some other type of way, or perhaps through civil war.
And when we talk about both Brazil and Angola, for those who aren't familiar with whose colonial territories those were, because they think of Spanish of all of the North and Southern Hemisphere, but we're talking about who?
The Portuguese.
That's right.
Portugal starts the Atlantic slave trade in really the early to mid 15th century. 1444 is the year often given because after 1444 you have a steady flow of Africans. And they use a series of means and methods to establish the slave trade. With regard to what is today Angola, northern Angola particularly, and the Bakongo people, the Kingdom of Congo is one of the initial trading partners in West Central Africa. And initially, the King of Congo he converts to Catholicism willingly, and he's interested actually in trading what the Congo has to offer, which is quite a few things, to Portugal. But with time, the Portuguese find a way to create an environment to change the incentive structure so that slavery will become the primary means of trade.
That recent movie about the women warriors, wasn't that a Portuguese trader they were dealing with?
They were dealing with the Portuguese trader. You're thinking of the Woman King.
Woman King.
About Dahomey.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, they were dealing with that. Well, this time it goes by too fast, but we want to make sure we talk about your Fulbright Scholar Fellowship to Brazil coming up here. And tell us how historic that is, because from my understanding, you're the first ever professor of color at South Alabama to receive this.
That's what they told me.
Okay.
I was very surprised by that because, there's a large black population here in Alabama. So I don't want to be the last.
Congratulations on that.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
And so what does that mean for those who aren't familiar with Fulbright Scholar?
Well, the Fulbright is a program through the United States State Department in coalition or with foreign governments. And it provides U.S. scholars, students, and artists the opportunity to collaborate abroad in creative ways, either by creating scholarship, teaching, or being involved in some other project of sustainability. My work, I was brought to this work because I wanted to know what were the historical factors that produce black male vulnerability in Brazil. And then instead of thinking about black men as compensating for a lack of power or seeking to dominate women or to dominate others. I wanted to understand what were the ethical foundations of Black Brazilian masculinity. So I'm looking to pre-colonial Angola,
Right.
to the Kingdom of the Congo, to other kingdoms as well, like Ndongo, for some of the ethical principles that boys were taught in the process of becoming men, and these societies that were known as quilombos.
Okay.
And I'm curious if some of those principles were preserved or how they were transformed under the pressure of racialization and physical and sexual violence.
And of course, you will be taking off here very soon that. And you'll be there for how many months?
A little over 5 months.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll look forward to having you back so you can share some of the things that you've learned once you prepare. And so will another book come from that too as well, you think?
That's the plan.
Okay.
That's the plan.
Okay.
Yeah. Knock on wood.
Well, we wish you a lot of success, and I just sitting here, my brain is going crazy because of I'm a history nut, and all the things that I have read over the years, and now some of the things that you are confirming, and studying the whole hemisphere instead of us just focused on what happened in America solely, but this was a hemisphere thing. Because we're talking Brazil, which is South America.
That's right.
You know, reaching down almost to the South Pole, and of course all the way up to the Caribbean and Florida. So it's a lot to consider. Well, we thank you so much for doing the research and for being concerned and interested in this. And congratulations also again on that Fulbright scholarship.
Thank you for having me.
We look forward to hearing more stories from you and your Brazil experience, because I can only imagine what it's going to be like. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
And there's the information. If you'd like to contact Dr. Perry, he'll be Petway. He'll be looking forward to hearing from you. Till next time, have a great one.